The gunshot cracked through the summer air like the earth itself had split open, and Theresa Blackwell did not flinch. She stood in the center of the Painted Rock Waystation's main yard with a rifle pressed against her shoulder, the barrel still smoking, and 30 men staring at her like she had just risen from the dead. The water barrel at the far end of the yard had a fresh hole through its center, and water was pouring out of it in a steady silver curtain, catching the late afternoon sun of the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1876. The men who had been attempting to take that water barrel and every other supply in the Waystation yard without paying a single cent were now very still. "The next one," Theresa said in a voice that did not waver, "goes through the wheel of your lead wagon, then the wheel after that. I have 12 rounds and I have been shooting since I was 8 years old. You are welcome to test my arithmetic." The foreman of the cattle drive, a wide man named Cutter with a face like dried leather, looked at her for a long moment. He was not used to being refused anything, least of all by a woman standing alone. He glanced around at his men, looking for someone to step forward and solve his problem for him. 30 pairs of eyes looked back at him. Not one of them moved. "Lady," Cutter said, his voice carrying a dangerous softness, "you are one woman at the end of the earth. You have no husband here. You have no law here. The nearest marshal is 40 miles east in Pueblo. I suggest you put that rifle down and let us take what we need." Theresa's jaw tightened. She had heard this speech before in different forms from different men in different places. It always ended the same way, with the speaker assuming that the mere stating of her isolation would cause her to collapse inward like a dying fire. She had been hearing it for 3 years now, since her husband James had died of fever on the trail west and left her alone at this waystation with a deed, a barn full of dwindling supplies, and a choice: fold or hold. She had chosen to hold every single day since. "My husband is buried 50 yards behind this building," she said, her eyes never leaving Cutter's face. "He died protecting what he built. I do not intend to dishonor him by handing it over to men who cannot be bothered to pay fair price for water and grain. The sign on that post says $2 a barrel and $1 a bushel. You have 12 wagons and need 4 barrels. That is $8 for the water, and I will give you the grain it costs because you have a hard drive ahead. That is my offer. It is generous. It will not be repeated." The silence stretched so long that Theresa could hear the cattle lowing somewhere beyond the south ridge, the enormous herd that this drive was pushing north toward Pueblo. She could hear the wind coming through the canyon to the west. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate, behind her ribs. And then she heard the sound of a horse, coming fast from the eastern road. The man who rode in was not part of Cutter's crew. He came on a dark bay horse that was road-dusty but well-muscled, the kind of animal that had been ridden hard and still had something left to give. He pulled up short at the edge of the yard and took in the scene with a single, measuring look. The woman with the rifle, the 30 men, the smoking barrel of a gun that had clearly just been fired. His name was Bernard Fairchild, and Theresa did not know it yet. She would learn it within the hour, and she would spend the next 3 years learning everything else about him, and she would never once regret any of it. But at that particular moment, he was simply a stranger sitting on a dark bay horse in the afternoon light, and he looked at the scene before him with calm brown eyes and said, "I seem to have arrived at an interesting time." Cutter turned. "This doesn't concern you, friend." "It might," Bernard said pleasantly. He swung down from his horse with the easy movement of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean through the chest and wide through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn canvas coat and a hat that had seen better days. There was no dramatic display of weaponry, no hand hovering near a gun. He simply walked his horse to the hitching post, tied it carefully, and turned to face Cutter with his arms loose at his sides. "I'm a stock inspector for the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. I have papers in my coat pocket, and I would be very glad to show them to you. I have also been following your drive for 3 days because we received a report in Denver that this particular operation was moving cattle with altered brands through the territory." He paused. "Which means that every man here is currently under the association's oversight, and any act of violence or theft at a licensed way station would be a federal matter. So perhaps the lady's offer of $8 for the water seems more reasonable now." Cutter stared at him. "I am also," Bernard added in the same unhurried tone, "fairly certain that the association's Denver office knows exactly where I am and when to expect me back, just so we have all the relevant information on the table." The silence this time was of a different quality. It had texture to it, like the moment before a storm breaks. And then slowly, like a man deflating, Cutter reached into his vest pocket and counted out 8 coins, which he set on the top of the fence post beside him. He jerked his chin at his men, and they moved, silent and resentful, toward the water barrels. Theresa did not lower the rifle until the first wagon was loaded and moving. Then she lowered it, and only then, with the immediate crisis resolved, did she notice that her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from the enormous, sustained effort of will that it had taken to keep them still. She set the rifle against the fence and looked at the stranger who had ridden in from the east. "I did not ask for your help," she said. He looked at her with those calm brown eyes, and something shifted in them, something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "I know," he said. "You had it handled, I just made it faster." She studied him for a moment. "Stock inspector." "Yes, ma'am." "With actual papers. Genuine ones. Would you like to see them?" "I would," she said. And that was how it started, not with moonlight or music or pretty words, but with a woman demanding proof and a man producing it without complaint. In that single exchange, without either of them understanding it yet, something between them began. To understand how Theresa Blackwell had come to be standing alone in that yard with a rifle, one had to understand what the Painted Rock Waystation was, and what it had cost to build it, and what it had cost to keep it. James Blackwell had been a practical man with a dreamer's heart, which is a combination that tends to either build something lasting or destroy the person who carries it. He had come west from Ohio in 1872 with a land deed, a wife, enough capital to start a way station along the cattle drive routes of the Colorado Territory, and an absolute conviction that the coming decade would see these plains fill up with commerce and movement, and that a well-positioned way station at the intersection of 2 major drive routes would be worth a great deal of money. He had been right about all of it. He had also been dead for 3 years before any of it paid off. The fever had come in the autumn of 1873, a brutal, sudden thing that had moved through several of the seasonal workers at the way station and taken James in 2 weeks flat. Theresa had been 26 years old. She had no family within 1,000 miles. She had a deed to a property that was just beginning to turn profitable, a small house she and James had built with their own hands, and a community of scattered ranchers and trail hands who were kind enough in passing, but who made no secret of their assumption that she would sell the place and go back east within the year. She had done no such thing. She had learned every aspect of the way station's operation, including the parts that James had handled and never thought to explain to her, because in 1873 it did not occur to most men that their wives might need to know the mechanics of their business. She had learned to negotiate supply prices with the merchants in Pueblo. She had learned to keep accounts, first poorly and then well. She had learned to manage the seasonal workers, a rotating cast of young men from various backgrounds who came through looking for wages and left with them, and who had tested her authority in every way available to them before discovering that she was utterly immovable. She had also, after the second time someone had tried to help themselves to her supplies without paying, learned to shoot well enough to back up her convictions. Her nearest neighbor, a rancher named Caleb Das who ran a small operation 12 miles to the south, had taught her, spending a patient series of Sunday afternoons teaching her to hold a rifle steady and breathe correctly and understand that accuracy was not about strength. It was about stillness. He was 53 years old and had a wife named Martha and 3 grown sons, and he had never once suggested that Theresa's situation was anything other than a challenge to be managed practically. She had been grateful for it more than she had ever told him. She had built a life at Painted Rock that was hard and solitary and entirely her own, and she was fiercely, privately proud of it. The loneliness was also real, a constant undercurrent beneath the daily work, a particular silence in the evenings when the workers had gone to their bunkhouse, and she sat alone in the house she had built with James and ate her supper by lamplight, and felt the specific weight of a life that had no one in it who was primarily hers. She did not speak of this to anyone. It was not the kind of thing that the West invited you to speak of. Bernard Fairchild came from a different kind of difficulty. He had grown up in Virginia, the second son of a family that had been comfortable before the war and considerably less so after it. His father had been a thoughtful man who died of a wound, sustained at Cold Harbor when Bernard was 12 years old, and his mother had been a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence, who had kept the family solvent through a series of increasingly creative economic arrangements throughout Bernard's adolescence. He had come west in 1868 at the age of 22, following a friend's confident description of opportunity in the cattle territories, and had discovered that what the friend had actually meant was hard physical labor in conditions that would have impressed a prison warden. He had worked cattle for 4 years, learning the land and the business and the particular culture of the drives, before being recruited by the Colorado Cattlemen's Association to do inspection and fraud investigation work. This suited him because he had a quality that was not common among men who chose the cattle trade. He was genuinely interested in how things worked. Not just cattle, though he understood cattle well, but the whole system of it, the economics and the deceptions and the pressures that turned honest ranchers into desperate ones and desperate ranchers into dishonest ones. He was not a judgmental man. He had seen enough to understand how darkness found its way into people, and he had chosen, somewhere along the way, to use that understanding to prevent harm rather than inflict it. He had been alone for most of his adult life, not as a matter of philosophy, but as a matter of circumstance. The work took him across 3 territories on a circuit that left no room for roots, and the women he had known had, each in their own way, made it clear that they needed someone who would stay in one place, and he had never been that person. He had accepted this as the shape of his life without particular bitterness, though there were nights when he sat alone in a camp by a fire and felt the particular awareness of absence, the way a man's hands know when they are empty. He had not expected Painted Rock. He had not expected Theresa Blackwell. He stayed that first night because his horse needed a rest and he needed a meal, and because the association papers he had mentioned to Cutter were genuine, and the altered brand situation on Cutter's drive was a real investigation that required him to document what he had witnessed at the waystation. He ate supper in the waystation's small dining room, which Theresa kept for travelers at $1 a meal, and she sat across from him because he had asked questions about the drive in a way that suggested he actually wanted the answers, which was unusual enough to warrant conversation. "How long have you been here alone?" he asked. He was not being tactless. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly and without the coating of false delicacy that people used when they thought a subject was fragile. 3 years, she said, since my husband died. That is a long time to run a waystation without a partner. It is, she agreed. She was watching him with dark eyes that missed very little. She had her brown hair pulled back severely, the way a woman who works outdoors learns to wear it, and her hands on the table were strong and slightly roughened. She was not a woman who had been made softer by 3 years of hard work. She had been made something else, something that was harder to name, more like iron that had been repeatedly worked in fire. "Are you going to tell me that I should sell and go back east?" "No," he said. "Everyone else does." "Then everyone else hasn't been paying attention," he said. "This waystation is perfectly positioned, your prices are fair, and you clearly know how to defend what's yours. The only thing I might observe is that your water barrel situation is going to get worse before it gets better. The drives coming through this summer are larger than last year, and some of the outfits are rougher. You might consider a second rifle." She stared at him. "That is the most practical thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." The corner of his mouth curved. "I'm a practical man." She refilled his coffee cup without being asked, which was, for Theresa Blackwell, an enormous gesture of approval, and she told him about the summer so far, the volume of traffic, the supply chain problems with Pueblo, the difficulty she was having getting the new roof on the barn finished because the 2 men she had hired had quit when they found better wages on the railroad. He listened with genuine attention, asking precise questions that showed he understood the operational complexity of what she was managing, and she found herself saying things she had not said to another person in longer than she could easily remember. He stayed 3 nights in the end, because the investigation required it, and because, if he was being honest with himself, which he generally tried to be, the investigation did not require all 3 nights. He was welcome to admit, in the privacy of his own mind, that he lingered. On the second evening, he helped her mend a section of the fence on the eastern pasture that had come down in a windstorm the week before. She had not asked him. He had seen her looking at it with the expression of a woman calculating hours in a day, and he had simply picked up the tools and gone to work. She had joined him after a moment's hesitation, and they worked together without needing to coordinate it, falling into a rhythm that suggested some kind of natural alignment between the way they each approached physical work, steadily and without drama, doing it right rather than doing it fast. "You don't talk much," she said at one point, not as a complaint, just as an observation. "I talk when I have something to say," he said. "Most people talk to fill silence." "I've never understood that," he said. "Silence doesn't need filling. It's fine on its own." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read and went back to work. That evening, sitting on the waystation's porch in the long summer dusk, she told him about James. Not the whole of it, but pieces, the way James had been, his particular combination of practicality and hope, the way he had loved this place even in its unfinished state, the fever and those terrible 2 weeks, the morning she had realized he was gone and had stood outside in the cold autumn air for a long time before she was able to make herself go back inside and begin the business of continuing. Bernard listened without trying to fix anything or offer comfort in the form of words that wouldn't help. He just listened, which was, she thought, an extraordinary gift. "I'm sorry," he said when she had finished. "He sounds like someone worth grieving." "He was," she said simply, and then, after a pause, "Tell me something about yourself." He told her about his father, which surprised him because he rarely did. He told her about learning to read ledgers at his mother's knee during the years after the war, and about the cattle years, the particular education of physical difficulty and wide open space, and about the work he did now, which he described with a characteristic precision, its purposes and its limits, and the moral complexities of operating in a system that was frequently unjust. He told her that the brand inspection work was important not just because it caught fraud, but because it prevented the violence that fraud generated, the range wars, and the retributive raids that destroyed families on both sides. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete and serious, and asked questions that went straight to the center of things. When the stars came out, dense and brilliant over the Colorado plain, neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. He left on the 4th morning early, before the first workers arrived. He had to get to Pueblo with his documentation, and then north to Denver to report, and the circuit would take him away from this part of the territory for at least 2 months. He stood at his horse in the gray pre-dawn light, and she stood at the door of the house, and there was a feeling between them that neither of them had named and both of them could feel clearly. "I'll be back through in the fall," he said. She nodded once. "The waystation will be here." "I know," he said. And then in the same unhurried way he said everything. "I'd like to see you again, Mrs. Blackwell. Not the waystation. You." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds something very carefully, like a hand cupped around a flame. "My name is Theresa," she said. "Bernard," he said. He rode east. She watched until he was a small shape in the distance and then went inside to start the day. And the day was the same as every other day, functionally speaking, except that it was nothing like any other day at all. The weeks that followed were the longest she had experienced in some time, which was significant because she was not, by nature, a woman who measured time by the presence or absence of another person. She had worked hard to ensure that she was not that kind of woman. The work continued. The drives came through, one after another, and she managed them with the same steady authority she always had, and she did not think about Bernard Fairchild more than was reasonable. She thought about him considerably. In August, a letter came through with the mail rider, which came once a week from Pueblo. The letter was from Denver, on association letterhead, and it was 4 pages long, which was not nothing in an era when paper and postage were not taken lightly. He wrote the way he talked, directly and with genuine content, describing the brand fraud case and its resolution, a successful prosecution that had recovered 30 head of cattle and cost Cutter his operator's license, which pleased her considerably. He described the city and the people and the particular quality of summer light on the Front Range in a way that was observational rather than literary, the writing of a man who paid close attention to the world around him. At the end, in the same tone as everything else, he wrote, "I think about our evenings on the porch more than I have told you, and I find I would like very much to tell you. I hope the fall traffic is manageable. I hope you are well. I hope, above all things, that you know that what I said about wanting to see you again was simply true." She read the letter twice in the house, and then folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept her important documents. Then she sat down and wrote back 4 pages of her own, and discovered that she had more to say to this man than she had said to anyone in years. The correspondence lasted through August and September, letters crossing each other in the mail, building something between them that was made of words and honesty, and a growing mutual recognition that was not quite like anything either of them had experienced before. He wrote about his work and his thinking. She wrote about the waystation and her observations and the specific texture of her daily life, including the parts that were difficult and the parts that were quietly beautiful, the sunrise over the canyon wall, the particular smell of rain on dry Colorado soil, the way the night sky over the plains was so enormous it made a person feel both small and significant at once. She wrote about loneliness once carefully. He wrote back about it at length, in a letter that she also kept in the box. He came back in October, as the aspens on the high ridges had gone gold, and the cattle drives were thinning out as the season ended. He rode in on the same dark bay horse, and she was in the yard when he arrived because she had been aware, without letting herself be too aware of it, of the approximate time she could expect him. She stood in the yard with her hands slightly dirty from the fence repair she had been doing, and he swung down from his horse and walked toward her, and when he stopped in front of her he looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "Hello, Theresa." "Hello, Bernard," she said. They stood there for a moment in the October morning, with the gold aspens on the ridge and the smell of autumn in the air, and the feeling between them was so clear and complete that it needed no decoration. He stayed for 2 weeks that time. He worked. There was plenty of work to do before winter, the roof on the barn that still needed finishing, the supply inventory that needed to be taken, the accounts that needed to be reconciled for the end of the driving season, and he worked alongside her through all of it with the same steady competence he brought to everything. The workers who were still there, 2 young men named Gil and Tamaz who handled the heavier labor, took his presence in stride after the first day, accepting him the way people in the West tended to accept capable strangers, with a provisional respect that required proving. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, or at the table inside when it did not, and talked for hours. They talked about everything. About the West and what it was becoming, the railroads pushing the cattle drives toward eventual obsolescence, the political situation in the territory, the question of what would happen to the land, and the people who had always been on it before the Europeans arrived. Bernard was thoughtful about this last subject in a way that was not common among men who profited, however modestly, from the same system. He had traveled through enough territory and seen enough to understand the scale of what had been taken from the people who had been here first, and he talked about it plainly, without either the dismissiveness that was common or the performative guilt that was equally useless. "It doesn't fix anything to feel bad about it," he said, "but it also doesn't help to pretend it isn't happening." "What does help?" she asked. "Fairness, where it's in your power to offer it." "I'm not sure I can do more than that," he said. "I'm one man, but I can do that much consistently." She thought about this for a long time after that conversation. She thought about her own small sphere of power, the waystation, the people who passed through it, the decisions she made every day about how to treat them. She thought about the Ute and Arapaho people who occasionally came through the territory, and whom she had always treated with the same straightforward fairness she offered everyone else, not out of politics, but out of a deep personal conviction that a person was a person. She had not always had words for why she did this. Bernard's framing helped. On the 10th evening of his second stay, after Gil and Tamaz had gone to the bunkhouse, and the lamplight was warm against the darkness outside, he sat across the table from her and said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about the circuit." She looked at him carefully. "And I have been thinking about whether it is necessary for me to continue on the current terms," he said. "The circuit covers 3 territories because the association designed it that way, but the southern Colorado section, the drives that come through this part of the territory, represents enough volume that it could justify a dedicated inspector, who would operate from a fixed location." She was quiet for a moment. "That would be a significant change to your work." "It would," he said. "It would mean staying in one place." "Is that something you want?" she asked. "Not is that something you would do for me, but is that something you want?" Because she needed to know the difference. He was quiet for a long time, and she respected him enough not to fill the silence. "3 years ago I would have said no," he said finally. "I would have said that I was not built for staying in one place. I had decided that about myself, and it seemed accurate." He looked at her steadily. "But I have been thinking about what I decided about myself and when I decided it, and whether the conditions that generated those conclusions still exist, and I find that they do not." She looked at him for a long moment. "Bernard, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "Yes," he said simply. "I believe I am, if you are willing to hear it." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a moment. The stars were out again, that extravagant Colorado sky. She thought about James and about what she owed him and about what he would have wanted for her. She had thought about this before in the abstract, and the answer had always seemed clear enough. James had loved her. A man who loves someone does not want them to be alone forever. That was not complicated. What was complicated was the fear. Not fear of Bernard, who had shown her nothing but steadiness and honesty. Fear of what it meant to open that particular door again. Fear of loving someone in a world that could take them away in 2 weeks of fever, that could empty a life in a season. She turned around. "I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "I should tell you that. If I am in something, I am completely in it, and I need the same from the person I am in it with. I cannot do partial things. I cannot do hidden motives or secrets or carefully maintained distance. I have been alone for 3 years and I have managed it and I will continue to manage it if I have to, but I am not interested in something that is less than real." "Neither am I," he said. "Then tell me clearly," she said. "What do you want?" "I want to be here," he said, "with you. In whatever form you are willing to offer, and I will accept whatever terms you set, because you know this place and yourself better than I can claim to. But I want to be honest with you about the whole of it, which is that I love you, Theresa, and I have been increasingly certain of that for several months, and I am telling you now because I am not interested in managing a secret." The word landed in the room between them, solid and irreversible and enormously present. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, and he stood up, and she looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said, "I love you too. I am terrified of it, but I love you." He put his hands gently on her face, and she put her hands over his, and they stayed like that for a moment, in the lamplight of the house she had built with someone else and was now beginning, quietly and decisively, to make into something new. He kissed her then, with the same quality he brought to everything, fully present and without hesitation, and she kissed him back with the enormous relief of a woman who has been carrying everything alone for a very long time and has, finally, on her own terms and in her own time, allowed someone to stand beside her. He wrote to the association in Denver the following week, requesting a restructuring of his assignment to the Southern Colorado circuit with a home base at or near Painted Rock. The response came back in 3 weeks, which was remarkably quick for institutional correspondence, and contained both an approval and a modest salary increase that reflected the volume of the territory he would be managing. He had written his request with his characteristic precision and had clearly made a compelling operational case. He showed her the letter over breakfast. "You argued it on business grounds," she observed. "The business grounds were legitimate," he said, "but that was not the only reason." "No," he said, "but I find that mixing personal and professional arguments in official correspondence tends to weaken both." She thought this was very sound, and told him so. The winter came down over the Colorado territory in November with genuine intention, cold and clean, the snowfall heavy on the ridge and lighter on the plain, the canyon to the west filling with a particular crystalline silence that Theresa had come to love during her years here. The waystation went quiet in winter, the drives ended, the traffic reduced to occasional travelers and supply riders and the mail. And for the first time since James had died, the winter silence was not the same as loneliness. Bernard moved his belongings into the waystation in November, into the spare room at first, and this arrangement lasted exactly 2 weeks before they acknowledged, without great fanfare, that maintaining separate rooms was an elaborate performance of a fiction that served no one. He moved into the main room and the house became, quietly and then completely, theirs. They were married in February of 1877 in the nearest town with a justice of the peace, which was Pueblo. Caleb Doss and his wife Martha came down from the south and stood as witnesses, and Martha cried in the good way that people cry at weddings when they believe in the thing they are witnessing, and Caleb shook Bernard's hand with the thoroughness of a man assessing another man's character, and found it satisfactory, which was, from Caleb, the highest available endorsement. The ceremony was brief because Theresa did not see the purpose of lengthy ceremonies. Bernard agreed. They had a dinner afterward at the hotel in Pueblo, which was the finest establishment the town offered, and they talked for 3 hours with the Dosses about the territory and the coming year and the state of the cattle industry. And by the time they drove back to Painted Rock in the wagon under a February sky brilliant with cold stars, Theresa felt a completeness that she had not known in so long that she had begun to doubt it was possible. She said this to Bernard on the drive back, quietly, watching the stars. He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the seat between them and held it without saying anything for a long time. Then he said, "It is possible." I was not entirely sure myself. The spring of 1877 brought one of the busiest cattle drive seasons the southern Colorado territory had seen in a decade, fueled by the expansion of the railheads in Pueblo and the increasing demand from eastern markets. The drives came through in waves from April onward, some small and straightforward, some enormous and complex, and Theresa managed the waystation with the same comprehensive authority she always had, now with the additional resource of a partner who understood the cattle trade from the inside, and whose presence had a measurable effect on the behavior of the rougher outfits. There were still hard moments. There always were. A dispute in May between two competing drives that both wanted the same water and pasture rights required an extended negotiation that consumed 2 full days and nearly resulted in the kind of range violence that Bernard had described as one of his primary concerns. He handled the negotiation with a patient tenacity that Theresa found remarkable to watch, finding the operational flexibility that allowed both outfits to get what they needed without losing what they considered essential, and the drives moved on without incident. In June, a young woman arrived alone at the waystation, traveling without any male escort, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Her name was Clara Hayes, and she was 20 years old, and she was traveling west from Kansas on a combination of determination and very little else, having been recently and forcibly removed from the household of an uncle who had decided her labor was his by right. She arrived hungry and without sufficient funds, and with a quality of defiance in her face that reminded Theresa of herself at a slightly younger age. Theresa fed her, paid her a fair wage to help with the waystation through the summer, and in the evenings asked her no questions that she had not already volunteered the answers to, which was the thing Clara most needed from another person. By August she had saved enough to continue west to Colorado Springs, where she had a friend from before the Kansas years who had offered a place to start over. She left with her wages, a letter of character reference from Theresa, and a borrowed riding horse that was to be left at the livery in Colorado Springs from which it would be returned. "You gave her a horse," Bernard said that evening, not in criticism but in the tone of a man noting something. "She needed one," Theresa said. "She could have taken the stage. The stage is slower and she has been slow enough," Theresa said. "Sometimes fast matters." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one where his eyes said what his voice did not immediately, which was that she was one of the most extraordinary people he had ever encountered in his life. Clara wrote to them from Colorado Springs in October. She had found work as a seamstress and was doing well. She was grateful in a way that filled the letter with something real rather than mere courtesy. Theresa read the letter twice and then put it in the box. Bernard noticed. He noticed most things she did. The summer of 1877 ended with the best financial year the waystation had recorded since James had started it, a fact that Theresa noted in the accounts with a satisfaction that was entirely her own. She had built this. She had kept it. And now, with a partner who worked alongside her as an equal and not an authority, it was flourishing in a way that felt like a vindication of 3 years of stubborn, solitary effort. In November she discovered she was pregnant. She told Bernard over breakfast, directly, in the same manner she told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, something that was too large and complex to be quickly named, a mixture of joy and gravity and something that was very close to awe. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also, if I am honest, somewhat frightened, but primarily well." He stood up and came around the table and held her, and she let herself be held, which was its own form of courage, and the Colorado winter came down outside, and the fire in the stove was warm, and the world was, in that moment, very small and very good. The pregnancy was not easy. The winter was harsh and the isolation pressed in, and Theresa had, despite her comprehensive management of most things, no experience with childbirth and no woman nearby to advise her with regularity. Martha Das came and stayed for 2 weeks in January, which was enormously valuable, and the doctor from Pueblo made a winter visit in February that reassured them both. The pregnancy was proceeding normally, he said. The baby would come in the spring. The baby came in the second week of March of 1878, on a morning when the first crocuses were showing through the snow at the base of the canyon wall, and the quality of the light had begun its subtle annual shift toward warmth. It was a boy. He was born in the bedroom of the house that Theresa and James had built, and that Theresa and Bernard were remaking, and Bernard was there through all of it, present and steady in the way he was steady about everything, holding her hand when that was what she needed and staying out of the way when that was what was needed and speaking to her in his quiet, direct voice throughout. When it was over and the baby was breathing and Theresa was exhausted and whole, Bernard held his son with the careful bewilderment of a man who has just encountered something for which he had no existing category. "What shall we call him?" Theresa asked. "I think that should be your decision," Bernard said. "You did considerably more of the work." She thought about it for a moment. She thought about the two men she had loved in her life, each in their specific way, and about what it meant to honor both while building something that was entirely forward-looking. "James Bernard," she said. "James for what came before, Bernard for what is." He looked at her. "You don't have to put my name in it." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms and looked at his wife and felt, in a way that was entirely new and a little terrifying, that his life had arrived somewhere. It had been traveling toward for a very long time without his knowing the destination. James Bernard Fairchild was a healthy, vocal baby who demonstrated, from his first weeks, a comprehensive set of opinions about the world, and was not shy about expressing them. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's measured expression, and he was, in the way of first children everywhere, the complete center of the universe for everyone at the Waystation. Gil and Tamaz, who had continued working at the Waystation, were both notably smitten with him and competitive about who could make him smile first in the mornings. Caleb Das, who came up in April for the first look, held him with a careful delicacy that was touching in a man whose hands were primarily accustomed to fence posts and cattle, and declared him the finest baby he had personally inspected, which was high praise from Caleb. Life at Painted Rock settled into a new rhythm, neither simple nor easy but full in a way that Theresa had stopped expecting. The Waystation business continued, busy in spring and summer and fall, quiet in winter. Bernard's circuit work continued, requiring him to be away for periods of time that she managed and he minimized, always returning on the day he had said he would return, always with a letter arriving a few days before him, so she knew when to expect him. The letters did not stop now that they were married. If anything, they lengthened, because they had discovered that writing to each other was a form of thinking they both valued, a way of processing the world that was different from conversation, but equally necessary. She wrote to him about the Waystation and the baby and the drives and the small daily events that accumulated into a life. He wrote to her about the territory and the investigations, and his thinking about the larger forces shaping the West, the railroads and the land politics, and the increasingly contentious question of the remaining open range. He worried in his letters about what would happen to the small operators, the ranchers and the independent Waystations, as the large commercial interests consolidated. She wrote back with her own assessment, which was characteristically direct, that the people who survived would be the ones who kept their costs controlled and their relationships honest, and that she intended to be among them. He returned from each circuit with a gift for James, small things, a carved wooden horse from a craftsman in Denver, a picture book from a shop in Pueblo, a piece of polished river stone from the Arkansas River that caught light in a particular way. He never arrived without something for Theresa either, though hers were different things. A book she had mentioned wanting, a letter of introduction to a merchant in Pueblo who could offer better supply prices, once a letter that was simply his account of a view he had seen from a ridge above Pikes Peak, written down because he had thought of her the moment he saw it. The trap, when it came, arrived in the summer of 1879 and came from a direction she had not anticipated. The man's name was Aldous Crane, and he was a representative of the Western Development Consortium, a land acquisition company operating out of St. Louis that had been systematically buying up waystation properties and ranch land along the major cattle drive routes in the Colorado Territory. He arrived at Painted Rock in July with 2 associates and a briefcase full of papers and a smile that had been precisely engineered to project trustworthiness. He offered Theresa a price for the waystation that was, on the surface, generous. 3 times the assessed value of the property, he said, was a remarkable offer that reflected the consortium's appreciation for the waystation's strategic position. He laid out his papers with practiced efficiency and explained, with the smooth delivery of a man who had made this speech many times, that the consortium was prepared to allow the current operators to remain as paid managers for a period of 2 years before a full transition of ownership. Theresa listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "No." Crane blinked. "Mrs. Fairchild, perhaps you would like to discuss the terms with your husband before." "My husband is away on association business," she said, "and I do not need to discuss it with him. The waystation is mine. The deed is in my name, has always been in my name, and will remain there. The answer is no." Crane's smile remained, but something behind it shifted. "The consortium has acquired every other major waystation on this route," he said. "We are prepared to be quite patient, and if necessary, quite persistent." "Then you will be persistently disappointed," Theresa said. "I am familiar with patience. I have been practicing it since before you knew this route existed. Good afternoon, Mr. Crane." But Crane had not built a career in land acquisition by accepting first refusals gracefully. The consortium's methods, Theresa would discover over the following months, included patience as a weapon, a series of pressures applied gradually and deniably. Their supply merchants in Pueblo began receiving inducements to offer Theresa less favorable terms. A rumor began circulating among the smaller drive operators that the Painted Rock Waystation was having financial difficulties, which was not true but was damaging nonetheless. One of her seasonal workers, a man named Draper who had come through the previous winter and seemed reliable, turned out to be on the consortium's payroll, providing them with information about the waystation's operations and finances. Theresa discovered Draper's arrangement in September through a combination of careful observation and a conversation with a neighboring rancher who had been approached by the same tactics. She confronted Draper directly, laid out the evidence she had assembled, and watched him fold within minutes. "I needed the money," he said. "I understand needing money," she said. "I do not understand betrayal. Take your wages for the month, which I am paying you because I said I would, and I keep my word, and leave this property." He left. When Bernard came back in October, she laid out the entire situation for him over the course of an evening. All the pieces she had assembled, the supply pressure, the rumor campaign, the Draper arrangement, the consortium's wider strategy as she had been able to reconstruct it from various sources. He listened to all of it and then sat quietly for a moment. "You have been managing this alone since July," he said. "You were on circuit," she said. "I handled what needed handling." "You have also," he said, "assembled what amounts to a pretty thorough intelligence picture of the consortium's methods, in 3 months. I had motivation," she said. He smiled. It was one of his full smiles, which were rarer than his partial ones and considerably more powerful. "What do you need from me?" "Your association contacts," she said. "The consortium has been acquiring properties across 3 territories. If their acquisition methods include supply interference and paid informants, which constitutes commercial fraud under territorial law, then there is a case to be made. I have documentation on what happened here. If you can connect it to a pattern across properties, it becomes something larger. It becomes a federal investigation," he said. "Yes," she said. "And I would like the consortium to understand that this particular waystation is not the weakest point in their plan. It is the place that cost them everything." Bernard spent 3 weeks in November in Denver, at the association's headquarters, and then at the Territorial Attorney General's office, building the case that Theresa had outlined. Her documentation from Painted Rock was, as she had assembled it, thorough and precise, and it connected cleanly to complaints that other operators had filed but had not organized into a coherent pattern. Bernard was good at patterns. He had always been good at patterns. The Western Development Consortium received a federal investigation notice in December of 1879, a few days before Christmas. 3 of their principals were indicted the following spring. The supply interference operations were dismantled, and several merchants received significant fines. Aldous Crane was not criminally charged but lost his position with the consortium and left the territory. Theresa received a formal letter of thanks from the Territorial Attorney General's office, which she read and then placed in the box with her other important documents. Bernard received a commendation from the association's board, which he mentioned to Theresa in passing and did not seem to think much about. "You built that case," she said. "You built it," he said. "I connected it to the wider pattern and put it in front of the right people. The architecture was entirely yours." She thought about this for a moment. "We built it," she said, and this seemed to both of them to be the most accurate version. Christmas of 1879 was the best they had had. James Bernard was nearly 2 years old and had recently discovered the concept of enthusiasm, which he applied to everything with tremendous focus. Caleb and Martha came up from the south, and they had a proper dinner, all of them together, with a roasted bird and canned peaches that were an outrageous expense and entirely worth it, and a small pine tree that Bernard had cut from the canyon slope, and that James spent most of the afternoon examining with the focused attention of a scientist encountering a new specimen. That evening, after James was asleep and the Dosses had retired to the guest room and the house was warm and quiet, Theresa and Bernard sat by the fire and she said, with a casualness that did not quite hide the weight behind it, "I am pregnant again." He looked up from the book he had been reading. His expression moved through several things quickly, joy and care and a protective tenderness that was part of who he was, and then settled into the steady warmth that was his characteristic register. "When?" he said. "July, I think," she said. "I will arrange the circuit schedule so that I am here," he said immediately. "I know you will," she said. And she did. That was one of the things she knew about him completely, the quality of his follow-through, his absolute reliability in practical matters. It was one of the things she loved most, because it was not a quality one could perform for long without it being genuine. 3 years with a person will show you who they actually are, and Bernard Fairchild in 3 years had shown her nothing but himself. She leaned against him where they sat, and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned down steadily, and the Colorado winter pressed against the windows, and inside the house was warm and full. The second baby came in July of 1880, a daughter this time, who arrived in the early morning with a decisiveness that suggested she had made up her mind about the timing and was not interested in renegotiation. They named her Alina, for Bernard's mother, with the middle name Rose for no more complicated reason than that Theresa had always loved the word and had never had occasion to use it. Alina Rose Fairchild was, in temperament, her mother's daughter, and all the more interesting for it. She was quiet in the way that busy people are quiet, conserving energy for specific purposes, and she watched the world with her mother's dark eyes and reached for everything she could reach. The Waystation, in the summer of 1880, was at the height of what it would become. The Colorado cattle trade was robust, and the railroad connections in Pueblo had expanded it, and the Painted Rock Waystation was by this point established as one of the most reliable stops on the southern route, known for fair dealing and quality water and a proprietress who would negotiate reasonably and defend herself if pushed. This last reputation had been built over years and was, by now, a kind of protection in itself. The rougher outfits that came through had heard the Cutter story, which had grown in the telling, and arrived with a degree of professional respect that made Theresa's job considerably easier. Bernard's circuit work, based from Painted Rock, had expanded as well. He managed a significant portion of the southern Colorado Territory now, with a small network of part-time inspectors who reported to him and whose work he supervised. The association had recognized that the fixed location model he had proposed was operationally sound and had extended it to other territories. He occasionally traveled to Denver for extended meetings that he found tedious but necessary, and always came home from them with a fresh appreciation for the particular quality of the life he had built on the plain. He had put roots down in a way he had not known he was capable of, and he had discovered that roots were not, as he had previously understood them, a limitation. They were an anchor. The difference was important. A limitation prevented movement. An anchor gave you something solid to push against when the world was difficult, and from which you could extend yourself without becoming lost. Theresa understood this, he thought, better than almost anyone. She had put roots down in grief and solitude, and had grown something extraordinary in ground that would have defeated most people. And she wore it with a quiet confidence that was nothing like arrogance, because it was nothing like performance. She was simply, entirely herself, and the self she was one of the most remarkable things he had encountered in 34 years of paying careful attention to the world. He told her this on a September evening in 1880, sitting on the porch with Alina asleep in his arms and James running in diminishing circles in the yard in the way of small children approaching exhaustion. She looked at him for a moment. "You are very good to me," she said. "I am accurate about you," he said. "That is different." She was quiet for a moment, watching James. "I used to think that being alone was a kind of purity," she said. "That needing no one was a strength. I was not entirely wrong about the strength part, but I was wrong about the purity. Needing people, the right people, does not diminish you. It gives you somewhere to put all the things you can do." He considered this. "James," he called to the small running figure in the yard. "Time to come in." James made the noise that 2-year-olds make when directed towards sleep, a noise of fundamental objection to the laws of nature, and came toward them anyway. Bernard handed Alina to Theresa and went to collect his son, and carried him inside, and James fell asleep in the middle of a complaint about the injustice of bedtime and was deeply unconscious before they had finished settling him. Standing in the doorway of the children's room with the lamplight warm on 2 small sleeping faces, Bernard and Theresa did not say anything for a long moment. The 1880s brought change to the Colorado Territory at a pace that made the previous decade seem leisurely. The railroads completed their expansion, making the long cattle drives progressively less essential and more a matter of tradition. Ranching consolidated as the economics of the open range gave way to fenced operations. Towns grew. The territorial population expanded as the homestead movement brought waves of new settlers, and the social fabric of the region became more complex and more contested. The Painted Rock Waystation adapted. Theresa had always understood that adaptation was survival, and she watched the changes in the trade with the same careful attention she had always applied to her situation and adjusted accordingly. As the cattle drive volume slowly declined through the mid-1880s, she had expanded the waystation's offerings to serve the new population of settlers and travelers, adding a more substantial boarding facility, a small general store that served the surrounding area, and an arrangement with the Pueblo Postal Service to serve as a local mail distribution point for the growing scatter of homestead claims in the region. Bernard's work had evolved as well. The brand fraud and large-scale theft that had characterized the open range era were declining as the range itself was fenced in, but new categories of fraud had emerged as the economics changed. Water rights disputes and land title fraud that was in some ways more complex and more damaging than the cattle fraud had been. He had become, through the accumulated experience of a decade, one of the more knowledgeable people in the territory on questions of land title and water rights, and he found himself increasingly consulted not just by the association, but by ranchers and new settlers who needed someone who understood the legal landscape. He began, in 1883, to study law formally, through correspondence with a firm in Denver that ran a distance program for practitioners in remote territories. Theresa read the materials alongside him when she could, not because she planned to practice law, but because she found the structure of it interesting, and because thinking alongside him was something she had always enjoyed. She was, his correspondence instructor wrote to him once, clearly an exceptional mind who had trained herself in practical reasoning to a degree that most formal legal students never achieved. Bernard showed Theresa this letter. She read it and then said with characteristic directness, "He's not wrong, but he sounds surprised, which is its own problem." "He is a man of his time," Bernard said. "So is every man," she said. "The question is whether that is a description or an excuse." He had no answer for this that was not simply an agreement, which he gave. Theresa became the primary legal resource for the surrounding area in a way that was entirely informal and entirely effective. She had no license and no formal title, and she charged nothing for the advice she gave to settlers who came to the waystation with deed disputes and water rights questions, and the various legal entanglements that the rapid growth of the territory generated. She understood their situations with a speed and precision that came from having faced versions of the same problems herself, and the advice she gave was practical and accurate, and the people who took it generally found it sound. Bernard was completing his law credentials by 1884, and she found, in a quiet, private way, that she had mixed feelings about this that she needed to examine carefully before she understood them. The feelings were not about Bernard, who was completely supportive and who consistently credited her thinking in ways that were genuine. The feelings were about the structure itself, the fact that the identical quality of legal reasoning she possessed would always be officially unrecognized simply because she lacked access to the formal system. This was not a new injustice. It was one she had lived with her entire adult life in various forms. Understanding it clearly did not make it smaller. She talked to Bernard about it one evening in a way that was unusually direct even for her. "I know," he said when she finished. "I have thought about this as well, and I do not have a solution that resolves the underlying injustice," he said. "What I can offer is that in every case where my credentials give me access to a room you cannot enter, I will carry your thinking into it and I will make sure it is heard as yours." She looked at him. "That's a significant promise." "It is one I intend to keep," he said, "and I will not pretend it is enough, but it is what I can actually do, rather than what would be theoretically preferable." She appreciated this, the refusal to comfort her with abstractions when the concrete was what mattered. He kept the promise, consistently, over the years that followed. When the water rights case that affected 6 families in the region south of Painted Rock went before the territorial court in 1885, the brief that Bernard submitted was substantially built on the legal reasoning that Theresa had assembled, and he said so clearly on the cover page. The judge was startled. The outcome was just. 6 families kept their water. James Bernard Fairchild turned 8 in March of 1886. And Eleanor was 6, and Painted Rock felt, on a spring morning with both children running in the yard and the aspens beginning to show on the ridge and the first cattle drive of the season raising a dust cloud on the south road, like exactly what it had become. A home that was both a place and a history, built over time by people who had chosen each other fully and worked alongside each other honestly and loved each other in the specific, irreducible way that people love when they have been through genuine difficulty together and come out holding the same thing. That spring, a third baby made its presence known. Theresa was 39 years old and told Bernard about it with the same directness she had told him about the first 2, and watched his face move through its now familiar sequence of joy and care and settling warmth. "Are you all right?" he said. "Always this first, always." "I am well," she said. "I am also aware that this one will require more careful attention to what the doctor says." "The Pueblo doctor is moving to Colorado Springs," Bernard said. There is a new one in Pueblo, a woman named Dr. Holloway. I have heard good things. Theresa raised an eyebrow. A woman doctor in Pueblo in 1886. That is a development. Doctor. Holloway completed her degree at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, Bernard said. She has been in Pueblo for 8 months, and I am told she is excellent. Then let us go to Pueblo and meet Dr. Holloway, Theresa said. Dr. Ruth Holloway was 32 years old and had the quality of a person who had spent a significant portion of their life being told they could not do what they were demonstrably in the process of doing, and had developed a particular efficient directness as a result. She and Theresa liked each other immediately in the way that certain people recognize something of themselves in a stranger. The third pregnancy was, as Theresa had anticipated, more complex than the previous two, not dangerously so but requiring more attention and more rest than she was accustomed to giving herself. Bernard enforced the rest with a patient firmness that she found alternately grateful and irritating, which he bore with equanimity. Dr. Holloway came to Painted Rock twice during the pregnancy, which was exceptional in an era when traveling to the doctor was the standard arrangement, and Theresa suspected that Bernard had arranged this and paid for it and not mentioned it to her because he knew she would have objected. She did not object, because Dr. Holloway's visits were genuinely valuable, and because she was 39 years old and had enough sense to accept help that was offered in good faith. She had learned over the years to distinguish between help offered in condescension and help offered in love. The first she declined without regret. The second she received as the gift it was. The third baby arrived in the first week of December, in a snowstorm that had come down hard from the north and sealed the world in white silence. A boy again, this one, rounder and more immediately vocal than James Bernard had been, announcing himself to the world with a conviction that suggested he had a great deal to say and no patience for delay. He has your intensity, Bernard said, looking at his new son. He has your lungs, Theresa said. She was exhausted and content in a way that was specific to having done something tremendous and come through it. She held the baby and looked at him and said, "William, I would like to call him William." "William," Bernard agreed. He sat on the edge of the bed, and the snow pressed against the windows, and William Fairchild breathed and shouted and breathed again, discovering the world with the thoroughness of someone who intended to make a great deal of use of it. James Bernard, aged 9, received the news of his brother's arrival with the measured consideration of a child who had thought carefully about the implications in advance, and concluded that a brother was probably acceptable. Eleanor, at 7, was directly thrilled, having wanted a sibling of either type for some time, and was allowed, under supervision, to hold William for several minutes that afternoon, which she did with a careful solemnity that was entirely her mother's. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was a hard one across the West. The brutal cold snap that struck the plains in January of 1887 and devastated cattle operations from Montana to Texas, known afterward as the Great Die-Up. Southern Colorado escaped the worst of it by geography and elevation, but the effects on the cattle trade were severe and lasting, and the industry that emerged from that winter was structurally different from the one that had preceded it, smaller, more cautious, more fenced. The Painted Rock Waystation was, by 1887, no longer principally a cattle drive operation. It had become the general store and postal station, an informal community center for a radius of 30 miles, serving a mixed population of remaining ranchers, homesteaders, and the staff of the growing number of small agricultural operations that were filling in the territory. Bernard had been formally admitted to the Colorado Bar in 1886 and maintained a small but steady legal practice operating from the Waystation, handling the land and water disputes that were the primary legal business of the region. They were not wealthy by any expansive standard. They were prosperous in the way of people who have managed their resources carefully and built something that serves a genuine need. And they lived with a comfort that would have seemed remarkable to Theresa of 10 years before, who had been calculating pennies over candles on a winter evening alone. The year James Bernard turned 12 and Eleanor turned 10, and William was beginning to become genuinely mobile and opinionated about everything. Theresa sat on the porch one evening in September and thought about the shape of her life with the specific attention that she brought to things that mattered. She had come west with James Blackwell in 1872, 25 years old, and full of a faith in the future that had been built on love and practicality in equal measure. She had lost him. She had survived the losing. She had built something out of the wreckage that was entirely hers, and that she was proud of with a completeness that needed no external validation. She had found Bernard, or Bernard had found her, or they had found each other in the particular way of two people who are both moving toward the same place without knowing what they are moving toward. She had built a family. She had built a business. She had participated, modestly but genuinely, in the making of justice in her particular corner of the world. She had been a woman alone at the end of the earth, and she had not folded, and she had not waited for someone to come and do the hard things for her, and she had not diminished herself into a shape that was easier for the world to manage. She had done all of this, and she was 40 years old, and the evening light on the canyon wall was the same extraordinary gold it had been every September since she had first seen it. And Bernard was putting the children to bed inside, and she could hear William's voice raised in protest at the concept of bedtime, which made her smile. The screen door opened and Bernard came out and sat beside her, and they were quiet together in the September evening, the way two people are quiet who have been talking for 10 years and have not run out of things to say, but have also learned that saying nothing is a conversation too. "He fell asleep mid-sentence," Bernard said, of William. "Always does," she said. "James is reading by lamplight again. He should sleep." "He should," Bernard agreed. "He won't." They sat for a moment more. "I have been thinking about something," Bernard said. "Tell me." "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about whether the consortium case is actually finished or whether there are remaining threads. I received a letter from the Attorney General's office this week. Apparently Crane has resurfaced in New Mexico territory under a different corporate structure." Theresa turned to look at him. "Are you being asked to consult?" "They are asking if I am willing to document what happened here in 1879 formally in a way that could be used in proceedings there if the pattern repeats." "Of course," she said without hesitation. "It may require a trip to Santa Fe." "I know you should go." He looked at her. "I thought you might say that. Crane is still using the same methods against people who have less to fight back with," she said. "That is not acceptable if we can do something about it." "We," he said. There was something in the way he said it, not surprise, just appreciation of the word, its persistent accuracy. "We," she confirmed. He did go to Santa Fe in the spring of 1888, for 3 weeks, and Theresa ran the waystation and the general store and the postal distribution, and managed a complicated water rights dispute between two homesteaders to the north with the same comprehensive efficiency she always had. The children helped where they were old enough to help. James Bernard with a seriousness that was his father's and Eleanor with a practical competence that was her mother's. And William ran everywhere and announced opinions about everything, and was 3 years old and entirely himself. Bernard's documentation in Santa Fe contributed to a successful prosecution of the New Mexico operation before it fully established itself. The Attorney General's office sent a letter to both of them this time, which Bernard noticed and mentioned to Theresa with quiet satisfaction. "They are learning," he said. "Slowly," she said. "But yes." The years continue to accumulate with the particular quality of years that are well-lived, not without difficulty and not without sorrow. Caleb Doss died in 1889 and Martha the following year, and these losses were genuine and felt deeply. But lives that are well-lived do not collapse under grief. They absorb it and continue, carrying what was loved forward into what comes next. Bernard Fairchild, at 15, began expressing a determined interest in becoming a physician, which Dr. Ruth Holloway, who had become a genuine friend of the family in the decade since the third pregnancy, encouraged with practical advice and a list of preparatory reading that was comprehensive and serious. Theresa supported this with the full force of her conviction that her daughter should be exactly what she was capable of being, and Bernard arranged for correspondence study through a Denver preparatory program in 1893. James Bernard, at 17, was reading law alongside his father with a depth that suggested he would eventually exceed him in it, which Bernard observed with the pride of a man who is not threatened by being surpassed by someone he loves. William, at 10, was the most physically capable of the three children, comfortable on a horse from the age of 6, and interested in the cattle and land side of the family's operation, with a passion that suggested he would eventually make it his primary work. In the summer of 1895, on a Saturday evening in July when the heat had broken, and the evening was as perfect as the Colorado Territory knew how to make them, Theresa and Bernard sat on the porch of the house that was no longer the small house she and James had built, but had expanded over 20 years into something larger and more complex, grown by a room at a time as the family and the life had grown. James Bernard was 19 and would be going to Denver in the fall to continue his legal studies at the Colorado College of Law, having secured a place through his own examination results without any intervention from his father, which both his parents found entirely appropriate and deeply satisfying. Eleanor was 17 and was in the middle of her preparatory studies and would, if all went as planned, apply to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 3 years, following the path that Dr. Holloway had blazed. William was 12 and had already demonstrated that the cattle operation he managed one day would be substantial and well-run. Bernard sat beside Theresa in the evening light, and the three children were visible from the porch in various attitudes of activity, James reading in the chair by the barn, Eleanor at the table through the open window, William somewhere beyond the south fence that marked the property boundary, moving along the horizon in the manner of a boy who finds fences to be suggestions rather than limits. "Do you remember the first time you saw this place?" Theresa asked. He considered. "Not this place, exactly. I rode in at the tail end of the cutter situation. My first impression was the smoke from your rifle. And what did you think?" "I thought," he said, "that whoever had fired that shot was someone I wanted to know." She smiled. It was not the contained, careful smile that she had worn for many years, the smile of a woman who had learned to hold certain things back to protect them. It was open and complete, the smile of a woman who has nothing left to protect against, which is not the same as having nothing to lose, but is the condition of having enough trust in the world to put the armor down. "I was very annoyed that you stepped in," she said. "I know, you told me. It still got handled." "It did," he said. "You were going to make it happen regardless." "Yes," she said simply, "I was." He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture he had made on the drive back from Pueblo in the winter of their wedding, the February stars brilliant above them, and she turned her hand under his and held it. The last of the daylight was going off the canyon wall in the west, the gold deepening toward amber and then toward the dark pink that preceded the violet of dusk, and the cattle in the south pasture were settling, and William's small figure was coming back toward the fence, and Eleanor's lamp was going in the window, and James had fallen asleep in his chair by the barn with a book on his chest, which was something his father had done at that age and his mother found endlessly touching. Theresa looked at all of it, her land and her family and her partner of 20 years beside her, and felt the particular completeness of a life that has been built on honest terms, brick by brick, with one's own hands, in the full understanding that no one was coming to do it for you and no one should be expected to. She had been the only woman at the cattle drive waystation who did not wait for someone to help her. She had helped herself, thoroughly and without apology. And in doing so she had, eventually, been found by a man who had not tried to help her from condescension or obligation or the assumption that she needed saving, but who had simply recognized her and stood beside her and called that love, which was what it was, and remained faithful to it for 20 years. She had built everything worth building with those two facts together. The evening settled into night over the Colorado plain, quiet and enormous and filled with stars, and the house behind them was warm with light and voices, and the particular living noise of a family that has made itself. And Theresa and Bernard sat on the porch of the life they had built and held hands in the dark, and were, completely and without reservation, home. William came over the fence and waved at them and ran inside, and a leaner called from the window something about supper, and James Bernard snorted himself awake and looked bewildered for a moment, and then gathered his dignity and stood up and carried his book inside. Bernard stood and offered Theresa his hand. She took it, not because she needed it to stand, but because she wanted to, which had always been the point, not need but choice, not desperation but the free and considered decision of a person who knows her own worth and offers herself anyway, as a gift rather than a necessity. She stood and they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the Colorado night came down over Painted Rock, vast and clean and indifferent in the way of the natural world, and the light in the window of the house held steady against it, warm and permanent and entirely self-made.